now going to revert to Ms. Janis Judson, who is a professor of law and political science at Hood College in Frederick, Maryland. She also serves as the chairperson of the Law and Criminal Justice Department. Professor Judson teaches a wide range of courses that include international law, immigration law, gender and law, as well as American constitutional law. She will discuss international law, human rights, and truth commissions, a model for restorative justice. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Not to repeat what we have just spoken about, so I'll make it very quick to end this. I've been working on a book on truth commissions, and as we've come to understand that international law, treaties, states, and doctrines, such as R2P, may themselves fail to protect indigenous populations in many parts of the world, specifically in Canada, in the U.S., I began to do a study of truth commissions. I attended the Canadian Truth Commission in 2008 in Saskatoon. I volunteered. I took testimony from Indigenous peoples who were telling their stories. I'll make it very quick, but in a few minutes I want to argue that my intention was to examine why it is the United States could not seem to follow in that way of thinking in terms of creating a truth commission for our own atrocities committed against our own indigenous peoples. Just as the R2P doctrine with its 3 pillars calling for prevention, reaction, and rebuilding, international law also imposes duties on states to bring perpetrators to justice, mostly through courts, provide reparations to victims, and 3, to uncover the truth. And it's this notion of truth, as you've mentioned, that really resonates. I had interviewed the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, and he said to me something very interesting. As commissioners of the TRC, we know now with absolute certainty that the road we travel is equal in importance to the destination we seek. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we are all forced to go to the distance with respect to human rights. Unfortunately, truth commissions often can only address the reaction and rebuilding tools of the R2P doctrine. We can only hope they will be a tool for future prevention. You've mentioned, I'll mention very quickly what is a truth commission. It's set up to investigate patterns of human rights violations in the past. It investigates a pattern of abuse, and I think that's what's so important, looking at patterns of abuse over a period of time rather than particular sets of circumstances. It's a temporary body, usually operating for up to 2 years. The Canadian Truth Commission was established in 2008, and it just ended its work last year, which tells you that it often can't achieve what it intends to do in that short time. 4 goals of the TRCs: seek to contribute to transitional peace by creating an authoritative record of what happened. Most importantly, to provide a platform for victims to tell their stories. This was really quite remarkable to listen to these stories. They recommend legislative or structural changes to avoid a repetition of the past, and they establish who is responsible and provide a measure of accountability for perpetrators. Truth commissions and restorative justice, as you mentioned, focus on harms done to persons and relationships rather than focus on the violations of law. A commission is not about penalties, but about the reconciliation process between perpetrators and their victims, and I've often been interested in finding out how does that reconciliation take place, and that's for another dialogue, I think. I don't have to go into the Canadian human rights violations with respect to residential schools and genocide and so forth, but I do want to mention I began to see the urgency of a commission for our own indigenous people. The United States has committed terrible atrocities, often under the rubric of formal laws, acts of genocide, massacres, residential school and the wholesale destruction of culture, which is part of the ethnocide that Canada saw in their residential schools. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs in the U.S. in the early 1900s said, "To fight them is cruel, to feed them is wasteful, while to educate them is humane, economic, and Christian." So I've come to understand, and I'll just say this without having to go through some of the repetitions, I've come to understand why the United States tends to ignore the tenets of R2P and the notions of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And this is, I think, a tragedy. Firstly, the U.S. is not a post-conflict or transitioning society, therefore it has no need to engage in the vetting of truth. I certainly do not believe that. These are points to be made about why the U.S. cannot engage in a legacy of examining human rights atrocities. The United States does not need to implement, they argue, a fundamental change in our power structure. The democratic model of governance already protects human rights. Courts use the model of due process and prosecutorial justice to litigate and find solutions to criminal acts. It is also said that the United States has apologized for some historical wrongs, the Japanese internment, the Tuskegee experiments, and so forth. The U.S. found in its heart it could apologize to the Rwandans and Guatemalans for our failure to intercede in their atrocities, but not for the major atrocities like slavery and the destruction of indigenous peoples such as Native Americans and Alaskan Natives. And finally, the U.S. would also say this about the notion of apologies that is very much connected to truth commissions. There's a fear of precedent or setting the rules for paying reparations, which of course clearly the Canadian government did do. There's a fear of domestic criticism or a loss of political agency for admitting human rights abuses. The United States, it has also been argued that we will be seen as weak if we acknowledge those. There is no political necessity, it is argued, for apologies and no disadvantages for not doing so. There is nothing to be gained by public, transparent expressions of wrongdoing. And this, I think, is particularly egregious. And lastly, part of the book that I'm working on is to make the argument of the narcissistic culture, the brittleness of American soul that cannot seem to address past legacies of human rights atrocities. So I'll end with that. Thank you.